Welcome to the Army and Battle section of my Bretonnia guide. In this section we'll be going over the entire Bretonnian roster and covering all the units' pros and cons, as well as compositions and formations for battle. Disclaimer, this guide was based on my personal experiences and opinions and is by no means the definitive way to play Bretonnia in Mortal Empires. If you have a different strategy or want to add something to mine, please leave a comment down below. Now that's out of the way, let's get into the video. In battle, Bretonnia focuses on cavalry above all else. They have the largest selection of mounted units so far, and over the campaign you really do end up using almost all of them. As I mentioned in the campaign section, the vows for each lord are going to affect which units you can bring into battle, but we're going to ignore that for this part and just focus on how they perform in battle regardless of upkeep. Due to the large selection of cav, there is basically a unit for any situation you can think of. Has the enemy brought a load of monsters that would massacre your front lines? Bring some anti-large. Have they brought overwhelming numbers of infantry? Bring some anti-infantry. Have they gone for air superiority? Just throw some Pegasus and Hippogriffs at them. On top of that, all land-based melee cav, apart from the Yeomens, have access to the lance formation, meaning they get a bunch of bonuses that will make them much better at taking out enemies with devastating charges. Unfortunately, this massive focus on cav means that the other units of the roster tend to get left in the dust. The melee roster, for example, is very mediocre, with even the most elite units having inferior stats to units of the same type from different races. There is also a lack of elite anti-large infantry, as the polearms tend to have awful leadership. The ranged units also don't get much love. For both artillery and infantry, there are combined 5 units and then a single ranged cav unit, so it's safe to say we're going to see some spam. And a final thing to note is that, for the most part, the roster tends to have pretty poor leadership, and it's not uncommon for units to rout within the first few minutes of combat if they aren't immediately winning. Now, onto the roster. Kicking off for the Bretonnian infantry are the peasant mob, and they are, without a doubt, some of the weakest units in the game. They're like zombies but worse because they retreat rather than stand and crumble to dust. But they were never meant to be damage dealers, as you can tell from their card. They're a meat shield that's meant to go ahead of your main lines to protect them from ranged fire or early charges. If they ever manage to reach the enemy and engage in melee, then don't expect them to rack up any kills while they rout from their awful leadership, and always make sure you have your more elite units there to move in to maintain pressure. Don't worry though, due to their expendable trait, seeing them retreat or get slaughtered won't affect your units since they happen to be expendable. I didn't really see a need for these guys once I unlocked shields, but if you're desperate for some numbers, then they're cheap and do their job well enough. I'd say about 4 units in a very early game army should work just fine. Men at arms are the next step up from the peasant mobs. They're essentially what you'd get if you gave your peasant mobs some weapons and armour and very mild combat training. They're still expendable and have poor leadership, but they can actually make it into combat as long as they aren't being focused. And while they won't rack up a large number of kills, they're actually okay keeping the enemies busy enough for your cav to get into position. Again, since they're expendable, when they eventually do rout or die, it won't affect your other unit's leadership, which is a little morbid if you think about it, but we're just going to glaze over that. They come in 2 variations, with and without shields. I'd always go for shields as soon as you can, due to the added missile resistance and melee defense, and I bring 2 of them in my mid-game armies so that I have a solid number to hold the line while other units do the damage. Spearmen at arms are essentially the same but with one key difference. They got spears instead of swords. Who'd have thunk it? Having spears gives them anti-large and charge defense against large, and as usual, this comes at the cost of some minor stat differences. They're still expendable and have poor leadership though, so don't expect them to stick around, but when they do leave, your other units won't be affected. Again, these guys come in 2 variations, with and without shields, and as usual, shields are always worth taking for the added defense in melee and from range. I like to take 2 of these guys with me in the early to mid game to protect my flanks from any charges and to focus down any large units in the front lines. As with men at arms, these guys aren't going to rack up a large number of kills, so are best used to delay the enemy to give your cav units a chance to get around the backs to break them with charges. Polemen at arms are basically the next step up from spearmen, and they obviously swap spears for polearms. They're still anti-large and now deal armour piercing damage, so actually mildly okay at taking on some mid-game large units. They also have charge defense against large, so are great for keeping your flanks safe from enemy charges without too much trouble. Unfortunately, they're still quite weak in terms of leadership, so they tend to rout if not properly supported by more elite units, but since they're still expendable, it won't affect nearby units when they do. They also lack any range defense since they have no option for shields, so you have to be careful not to let them take too much ranged fire before the melee lines clash. I recommend taking 2 of them to replace your spearmen, and I tend to keep them with me until the endgame, as there really isn't any other anti-large infantry to choose from. They're best used on the flanks of the front lines so they can protect from charges and focus down any large targets, but as usual, they do need to be supported by cav to be really effective. Finally, we have some guys who are actually more trained than random peasants. Battle Pilgrims are a solid front line of the mid-game, and they come with the best feature we've seen yet, leadership over 60. Aside from that, they're also shielded, so can take quite a bit of punishment from range before they start to suffer. They also have the frenzy ability, meaning they're much more effective at high leadership. This means it's important to get them into combat as soon as you can to avoid missing out on that bonus. I take 2 of them to replace half my men at arms, and they're best used in the thick of combat to hold the line to allow your cav to get behind the back and pick apart the enemy from there. Unlike men at arms, these guys can actually get quite a few kills as long as you pick your targets well and keep their leadership high with Lord and Hero support. Foot Squires are the last of our main infantry units. They're the great swords of the Bretonnian roster, and they have an anti-infantry and armour-piercing damage. They won't be able to go toe-to-toe with other elite infantry, but they can do exceptionally well against large numbers of lesser infantry. They're damage dealers, so want to spend as much time in sustained melee as you can to ensure they rack up as many kills as possible. Unfortunately, they don't have access to any shields, so can be taken apart from sustained ranged pressure, so be sure to keep them safe for as long as you can, so that they're spending their health where it counts. I get 2 of these guys with me into the endgame to replace my other 2 men at arms, and I use them in the thick of melee against whatever elite infantry the enemy might bring, and of course support them with my cav. Our final melee infantry unit is actually for support. The Grail Reliquae is the corpse of a saintly knight being carried around by a couple of very devoted followers of the lady. They're actually more useful than it would seem. They have a magical aura which provides 12 leadership and immunity to psychology to allies in a 55 meter radius, which is great for keeping your more cowardly troops in battle for that little bit longer. They also have frenzy, so can do some decent enough damage when they're at high leadership, but they aren't killing machines, so don't expect them to carry your army. They're particularly useful in the early game when all of your front line has poor leadership, as they get them to stick around, allowing your cav to clean up before they reach your ranged units. I took 2 of them with me into the near endgame when I swapped them out for more cavalry to make up for the added chance of retreat. I keep them in the midst of my front lines so they can affect as many units as possible and prevent retreats. It also helps that they are pretty fast, so can be sent where you need the buffs even if it's quite a ways off. Kicking off and closing for the ranged infantry are the peasant bowmen. They are another of the units that we get by pulling peasants off the street and send them to fight with a bow and arrow. They have pretty good range but lack accuracy, so you want to be careful to aim for targets that aren't near your other units when possible to minimise friendly fire. They also suffer from very poor leadership, so you need to make sure they're protected from melee attacks or they'll break almost immediately, but since they're expendable, if it does happen, it won't be too detrimental to your men. They come in 3 variations: standard, fire, and pox arrows. Fire arrows obviously make their attacks do fire damage, which is effective against undead and big clumps of unarmoured infantry, but tend to struggle against pretty much anything else. Pox arrows are poisonous, so affect any enemies hit with the poison debuff, which makes them much less effective in melee, which is obviously a good thing. They're all used in essentially the same way. Place them up front to begin with so that you can get off some shots early, and then move them back once the melee charge gets too close. They can fire over heads, but it's better to give them a good angle so you can minimise friendly fire, especially if you're aiming for the front lines. I start off with 2 to 4 standard bowmen, then once I unlock fire and pox, I switch to 2 of each so I have some variety to my damage. Now we get to the largest category by far, cavalry. First off from the melee cav are the mounted yeomen. They're very fast and come with vanguard deployment, so you can get to where you need them on the battlefield right out the gate with little chance of being caught. They also have shields, so have some resistance to range damage, but don't leave them under sustained fire as they won't last too long due to poor leadership and armour. Since they are the first cav unit you unlock, I took 2 to 4 of them and used them to get around enemy flanks to do what cav does best, target any ranged units before coming back to shatter melee lines with rear charges. It's best to use them in cycle charges against anything even mildly elite, as they won't do particularly well in sustained melee. Unlocked at the same time with a single ranged cav unit that Bretonnia has, the mounted yeoman archers. They also come with vanguard deployment and are very fast but lack shields of standard yeomen, meaning that they're more vulnerable to ranged fire. It's useful to deploy these guys as close to the enemy lines as possible so you can get some shots off right out the gates, before they even reach your front lines, before retreating back to safety as melee approaches. Once lines are established, they can make their way around to shoot into enemy backs. It's also worth focusing weaker and less armoured units as they don't really do anything amazing in terms of damage. I take 2 of them in the early game as they are just useful at taking out much weaker enemy units, but once I get to the mid game, they just become ineffective against enemy armour, so I swap them for more elite cav. Knights Errant are first up, and they're a step up from yeomen but still pretty basic. They keep the shields but this time also get armour, so are a bit more resistant to damage of all types. They're also an anti-infantry unit, so are great at taking out enemy infantry units with devastating charges. Since they bring lancers, they're better suited to cycle charges over sustained melee combat and will not last long if they're left in a mess of enemy units. I like to bring 2 of these guys to replace my mounted yeomen as soon as they're unlocked, as they're just more useful in every way. As with all cav, you want to focus them on ranged units to begin with, before targeting the backs of melee lines until they break. It can also be worth sending them to run down broken units until they shatter to ensure they don't come running back, especially if it's something more elite. Knights of the Realm are our first anti-large cav unit. They're armoured and shielded so can take a decent amount of punishment, but again, it's not a good idea to leave them in melee any longer than you need to. As I said before, they're anti-large, so get a bonus in damage when sent against anything bigger than a man. This doesn't mean they're useless against infantry, as they actually have a better charge bonus than a knights errant, so it'll break melee lines even faster. I take 2 of them alongside my knights errant in the early to mid game to have some variety in my roster. In battle, I first focus them on anything large the enemy has brought before sending them back to help mop up anything that's left. And of course, it's always worth running down broken units if you can to ensure they don't cause you any more trouble. Questing Knights are our first sword cavalry and are of course an anti-infantry unit. They're armoured but not shielded, so can be vulnerable to ranged fire if the enemy decides to focus them down, but if you keep them on the move you should be okay. They deal armour piercing damage with bonus versus infantry, so are great for sending in to sandwich enemy melee troops between them and your front line. I take 2 of them with me and replace my knights errant as they fill the role so much better and require less micro, which is always a win in my book. Obviously it's useful to get charges off into ranged units as well as the backs of melee, but you can get away with leaving them in some light sustained melee as long as it isn't against anything too elite. And of course, as with all cav, charging down retreating units is always a good idea. Grail Knights are up next, and these guys are literally living saints. They're armoured and shielded, so can take quite a lot of punishment from both ranged and in melee, but since they're short cav units, they shouldn't be sat still for too long. Their lancers give them fantastic charge bones as well as a bonus against large, so they can break both infantry and large units with very few charges. Of course, this comes at the cost of being a bit vulnerable in melee, so it's best to keep them on the move as much as you can. As I said before, these guys are living saints, which means that they have perfect vigour, great leadership and magical attacks. I take 2 of them with me as soon as they are unlocked, and they come with me until almost the endgame, as they're of course best used to focus down any elite large units with devastating charges to make them break, and if they run out of those targets, they're just as exceptional at taking out infantry. Grail Guardians are very similar, but they swap the lancers for swords, which gives them a bonus versus infantry. They're still armoured and shielded, so can take a whole lot of punishment in melee before they really start to feel it. Bringing swords gives them anti-infantry bonus as I said before, but it also makes their charge a lot less impactful whilst making them much better in sustained melee combat. These guys are also living saints, so get the vigour, leadership and magical attacks that comes with that. I take 2 of them with me and keep them to the endgame as they're just amazing at pinning melee units in a sandwich that they cannot escape from. They're of course worth using to charge when you can, but don't be afraid to leave them in melee with almost any units as they can do some serious work with little micro from you, which is always a win. Pegasus Knights are the first of our flying cavalry units. They're armoured and shielded, so can take quite a lot of punishment from both range and in melee before they start to feel it. They're extremely fast and can obviously fly, so it'll be very difficult for enemies to hit from range as long as you keep them on the move. This manoeuvrability is also fantastic for getting them around the enemy backs at targeting exposed troops that would otherwise be safe from good charges. They also have vanguard deployment, so can start right up in front of the enemy to get around their backs right out the gate. These guys also come with a bonus against large and a pretty substantial charge bonus, so are great for going after enemy cav before they can attack your flanks. I take 2 of them, and as much as it pains me, I replace my Grail Knights as the added speed and versatility makes up for the lesser charge bonus. Theirs is nothing to scoff at however, so it's definitely worth cycling to get the most out of them. Since they are so fast, they can cross the battlefield in a matter of moments once they're in the air. So don't be afraid to send them from one end to the other if you need support. Their speed also makes them great at running down retreating units, so if you have no better targets, be sure to do this. Royal Pegasus Knights are very similar, but they're now living saints to get a bunch of bonuses that come with that. They obviously get the perfect vigour and magical attacks, but there's no leadership buff this time. Overall, they tend to do pretty much the same as regular Pegasus Knights, so can get some pretty great charges off, as well as some light sustained melee. I of course take 2 of these guys to replace regular Pegasus Knights and use them in basically the same ways as I said last time, so no need to repeat that. Finally, we come to the Royal Hippogriff Knights. These guys are monsters and are one of the few units that I would actually recommend from Bretonnia. They're armoured and deal armour piercing damage, so can go toe to toe with some seriously scary infantry and come out on top. They also cause terror, so have a chance to rout enemy units the moment they hit the battlefield. They don't have the best charge bonus, but can still knock units around when they clash and do some great damage in that initial melee. I take 2 of these guys with me into the endgame as soon as I get them unlocked, as you'll struggle to find anything that does their job better in the roster. In battle, they're great at targeting any melee units that your front line's having trouble with and making sure the tide quickly turns. Since they're flying, they're incredibly fast and can cross the battlefield in moments if you need them, so don't be afraid to have them all over the place putting in work. Finally, we come to our last unit, the one and only artillery unit of the Bretonnian roster, the Field Trebuchet. It fires armour-piercing missiles that can do some serious damage to enemy infantry in all tiers if left unchecked. You do have to be careful not to hit your own men though, as once the melee lines are established it can be very easy to get some splash damage. They come in 2 varieties, normal and blessed. Bringing the blessed version causes the missiles to be, well, blessed. This means that they do more damage and it's magical, so can cut through resistance and armour with ease. This also means that the missile's explosions do not damage your own men, meaning you can fire into the front lines as much as you want with much less risk to your own troops, which is insanely useful. I take 2 in my armies and replace the standards with blessed ones as soon as I can, as they're so much better for the tiny increase in cost. I of course keep them right in my backlines and target any particularly tough units that enemies might bring and make my cav and melee job even easier. As usual, I'll call out the regiments of renown and what the differences are from the base units. The Holy Wardens of La Maison are Battle Pilgrims. They gain bonuses to leadership, melee attack and defense, weapon strength, and charge bonus, as well as gaining magical and fire attacks at the cost of losing their shields. The Beast Slayers of Baston are Foot Squires units. They gain armor, leadership, melee attack and defense, weapon strength, and charge bonus. They also become anti-large rather than anti-infantry and get charge defense to go with it. The Defenders of Fleur de Lis are Knight Errants units and gain bonuses to leadership, melee attack and defense, as well as the frenzy trait. The Knights of the Lionhearted are a Knights of the Realm unit and gain bonuses to leadership, melee attack and defense. They also get magical attacks, can cause fear, and encourage nearby ally units to increase their leadership. The Companions of Cornels are a questing Knights unit and gain bonuses to leadership, melee attack and defense. They also gain a resistance to fire, as well as the Blessing of the Lady. Finally, the Wardens of Montfort are a mounted yeoman archers unit, and they gain bonuses to leadership, melee attack and defense, charge bonus, and missile damage, as well as poison attacks. Now we come to my ideal endgame composition for the campaign. I have 2 Pole Arms, 2 Battle Pilgrims, and 2 Foot Squires that add variety to my frontline damage and can send each unit to focus targets that are best for them. I take 2 Fire Archers and 2 Pox Archers so that I have a variety to the damage I'm putting out and can focus on different units where needed. I bring 2 Grail Guardians to assist my front lines in some sustained melee, 2 Royal Pegasus Knights to chase down any cav or large units the enemy might bring, and 2 Royal Hippogriff Knights to go against whatever is left over. I bring 2 Blessed Field Trebuchets to pick apart the enemy from afar and focus down any tough units that make my melee line's jobs easier. Finally, I bring Melee Lords and a Wizard so that I have damage of every kind being done. The Wizard I take depends on my needs, but for this example I used Heavens as they have the best damaging spells. Now to see how this arm performs, I'll hand you up to Miles. Take it away. Thanks, Miles. Okay, I've just paused this to begin with, and I'm just going to kind of try and explain what I'm trying to do, right? So I place these guys up here for the reason that I'm going to try and get them around the back and try and draw some of their ranged units to shoot me here. It didn't really work out, as we're going to see. I'm just going to start in slow motion, and I am targeting my artillery to go for these great swords here. They're not really in any particularly large blobs, so I can't really go for that. So I just kind of went for 2 separate, there you go, 2 separate great swords units. And I'm not really making a big advance, to be honest. This battle didn't go the best, but I still won it. So I'm just going to explain to you what I could have done better as we go into. So let's go. Right, the ranged units are up front, so they're all trying to move over here. Because I can see these guys coming in, so I'm like, right, I want to get the ranged units up front so I can do some damage to begin with. I should have been paying more attention to these guys because these Demogryph Knights came in and did some serious damage to me. But, you know, we made it okay. Illuminac Pie Shot just came in there and managed to miss my Hippogriff Knights, which is fantastic. But, yeah, my Grail Guardians over here, they kind of get torn to shreds by the artillery. Okie doke, let's just fast forward this a little bit. Right, so I've moved these guys over here and then just kind of forgot about them, which is terrible. I really shouldn't have done that. And they do kind of get peppered quite a bit. In fact, I think one of the Pegasus units gets completely destroyed. There we go, I've just started moving them again. Don't think I send them in just yet. I think I just kind of try and move them around so they're not stood still and being easy targets. There we go, some of their units have come to range, so I'm just peppering them now. I ain't actually targeted, they are just doing that automatically. Grail Guardian's getting absolutely destroyed by that Hellstorm rocket battery. The Empire has some of the best artillery units in the game, I love them. And there we are, some Royal Pegasus Knights got sent in against some range units and kind of got caught out by the Demogryph Knights and again ripped to shreds. But you know what, that's okay. Acceptable casualties, as they say. Right, these guys again just kind of stood still. More Royal Pegasus Knights getting torn to shreds by these missile units. Really should have been paying more attention. But you know, that's me. These guys just come around into position. Move my great swords. Oh, their great swords coming into me, sorry. And I'm moving on my melee units in front of the ranged units to try and block that charge, which I will do successfully. The spellcasters up front and their Demogryph Knights are in my Foot Squires, which isn't the best target for them. But you know, I think we'll be alright. There we go. I've just sent the Foot Squires in to take on their greatsword units. Halberds have just come in to surround these Demogryph Knights, which is fantastic. Where's Lewin? He should really be in here. Oops, some Royal Pegasus Knights have just rallied. I think the other ones that were over here and were caught out. There we go, the Hippogriffs are in, and they are just doing so much more damage than the Pegasus Knights because they are just fantastic. And look at these guys. They're against the Sigmar Sons who are unbreakable, but they are still 31 kills already. Doing fantastic. And what are these guys on? 41. Fantastic. Yeah. This frontline charge here was a little bit messy, but I did manage to win it, even though Bretonnia has awful leadership compared to Empire. I managed to break those Grey Swords by just ganging up on them with like 3 units. So that's fantastic news for me. Grail Guardians, they're absolutely destroyed. These guys coming in for a charge on the artillery, which I think goes okay. I can't quite remember. I played this battle yesterday. There we go. Lewin's against their Boris Todbringer, who is the Empire captain that was randomly selected. And he has won that, and Boris will start to retreat. I think I'll start sending these halberds against something else, possibly these these Demogryph Knights. Pulled out those peasant bowmen over there so that I can get more range shots off with them. I'm not done with them yet. Should really be turning them around, but I'm not. This is a very messy battle. We started off quite far away and we never really managed to fully clash, which is just fine, because we still managed to do some pretty good damage to them, but you know, it didn't go the best. Oh dear, some friendly fire there. I think I targeted all these guys, yep, to fire in one place. I think I noticed quite soon that they're not doing anything, so I begin to target them, but until then, they are being pretty useless. I'm not the best at battles if you haven't noticed, but I have my own playstyle. I have fun and I managed to get the victory. Spoilers. There we go, some fantastic shots on the Peasant Bowmen, very, very underrated on the card. They say they're going to be terrible, but they're actually not too bad if you know, just focus them down and don't get too much friendly fire. But they're certainly not where Bretonia's strengths lie, which is obviously the fantastic Cav. Great swords here, getting charged by the Demogryph Knights. They should be okay, they are losing that, but Luen's over there to keep them happy. Who we got here? We got a Wizard against the Empire Captain, which is not a good match. But again, Luen's nearby and he's also been backed up by some Halberdiers, so that should be just fine. Deathjack Archers got caught out there and they are just shattered and they will not be coming back. Oh, and there we are. The big chain rout is happening. And there's the victory. Well, the victory apart from Sigmar's son, but you know, we'll just fast forward to that. But you know, overall the battle went well enough. It was a bit messy, and my cavalry units, I'm not the best with cav, so a few of them did get seriously injured, but apart from that, it went pretty well. Let's just skip to the end here and see the stats. So as you can see here, Halberdiers didn't do fantastically well. They were kind of caught out. Look at the melee units, not getting many kills themselves, but to be honest with Bretonnia, they don't really need to. It's the rest of the units that really want to be doing stuff. Luen didn't get any kills himself, but again, I sent him straight after Toddy, so it wasn't really his job. Spellcaster got a few spells that I did there that we didn't manage to catch. Peasant Bowman did pretty well over like a combined, what's that, like 150 kills, which is pretty good. Those units of Grail Guardians were absolutely screwed. Those units did very well against the artillery. Royal Pegasus Knights, about 140 between them. Hippogriffs, 230 between them, and of course the Trebuchets did pretty well themselves, so overall, I think that went pretty well. Back to you, Miles. That concludes this section of the guide on Bretonnian armies. Next time we'll cover the Lords and Heroes and what they can do for you both in campaign and on the battlefield. Thanks for watching this section of my Bretonnian guide. If you want to check out the other parts, there's a link in the card and in the description for a playlist to the series. Don't forget to vote on the poll for the next race you want me to make a guide for, which is linked in the description and the comments. If you enjoyed this video at any point, please do consider leaving it a like, as it really does help out a lot. And if you want to see more of this type of video, maybe click that subscribe button so you can stay up to date. After all, it is free. For now though, I was COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.